They said Spartan men were born to die for glory, but no one spoke of the women left behind. Behind every spear raised in victory stood a wife forbidden to mourn, a mother ordered to be silent, and a city that worshipped discipline more than mercy. In Sparta, the battlefield did not end with death. It continued inside the homes of widows in the rituals that stripped them of grief, voice, and even their names. When a man fell, the city rejoiced. When his wife wept, she was punished. And for one woman named Irene, her husband's death marked the beginning of a darker war. One fought not with shields and spears, but with silence, obedience, and fear. This is not a tale of soldiers or kings. It is a story of a woman who stood inside the heart of Sparta's cruelest tradition, a tradition designed not to honor the dead, but to control the living. What she endured would test the boundaries of love, loyalty, and human endurance. What she lost would echo through the ages as one of the most chilling rituals of the ancient world. The men of Sparta were raised for war. From the moment they could walk, they were taught to obey commands sharper than any sword. But their wives, they were trained for something far more brutal, survival in the shadow of death. When a Spartan husband died, his name was carved in bronze, his courage celebrated in temples. But his wife? She was erased. Her tears were seen as weakness. Her sorrow was shameful. The moment her husband's blood spilled on foreign soil, her life stopped belonging to her. It belonged once again to the state. That morning, before the sun broke over the hills of Taygetus, Irene woke to silence. The kind of silence that pressed against the walls heavy and alive. Then came a knock. Once, firm, final. When she opened the door, no one stood there. Only a small bronze disc, still damp with wax. Its seal bore the insignia of the Spartan War Council. No words, no messenger, just the symbol. Every Spartan woman knew what it meant. Her breath caught. For a moment she told herself it could be a mistake. Perhaps a summons, a notice, a delay. But deep inside she already knew. The night before she had dreamt of the sea, waves washing footprints from the sand until only emptiness remained. Dreams like that were never coincidences. In Sparta, omen and order often walked hand in hand. She knelt by the doorway, her fingers trembling as they brushed the wax seal. Her body wanted to cry. Her throat refused. Crying was forbidden. It was seen as betrayal, a wound against the pride of a warrior's death. To mourn openly was to dishonor the man who had fallen, and so, she didn't weep. Irene pressed the disc to her chest, feeling the faint heat of the wax through her tunic. "Irene," she whispered under her breath, just once. That name, soft as breath, vanished into the stone air. Then she rose, she dressed with precision. Every fold of her crimson mantle lay perfect, every pin fixed tightly in place. The color red was sacred. It symbolized courage, blood, endurance. And she would need all three. Outside, the streets were already stirring with the rhythm of mourning. Soldiers sharpening spears, merchants stacking amphorae, children carrying water from the wells. But to Irene, it all sounded distant, hollow, like echoes underwater. The city did not stop for grief. It never did. Before the sun reached its peak, 2 boys appeared at her door. They were barely 15, their hair cropped short, their shoulders still thin. They wore the markings of orphans, sons of warriors who had already died. Without speaking, they bowed and gestured for her to follow. She didn't ask where they were taking her. Every Spartan wife knew the path. The Black Court. The building stood near the city center, windowless and cold. Its outer wall bore no inscription, only a single carving of a woman's face with her mouth sewn shut. Inside, the air smelled of ash and stone dust. Torches burned low, and every step echoed like a heartbeat in the dark. The boys led her into a long hall where 3 elders sat behind a table of polished marble. Their robes were black, their expressions fixed in a calm colder than the walls. They did not greet her. They did not look up. One unrolled a scroll and read in a voice that sounded like a verdict carved in stone. "Your husband, Irene of House Timarchus, has fallen in Phocis. You have 7 days to prepare for the rite of stillness. Failure or refusal will result in erasure from the citizen rolls and exile beyond Taygetus." That was all. No condolences. No farewell. The scroll rolled shut. The sound it made, parchment against marble, was the only sound in the room. Irene tried to speak, but her voice caught in her chest. She wanted to ask how he died, whether he suffered, whether he was brave, But she knew better. The council allowed no such questions. The state did not mourn. The state did not comfort. The state only reassigned. She lowered her head. I understand. The words came out dry and hollow. They dismissed her with a flick of the elder's hand. The boys escorted her back through the cold corridors. As they reached the doorway, one of them hesitated, glancing up at her before pressing something into her palm. A piece of cloth folded neatly, crusted with dried blood. Irene's headband. The scent of sweat and ash hit her like a blow. The boy didn't speak, didn't need to. His eyes said everything. Irene closed her hand around the cloth until her nails bit into her skin. When she stepped outside, the sunlight burned her eyes. The world looked the same. Markets alive, soldiers drilling, bells tolling. But she was no longer part of it. To the others, she was already half gone. In Sparta, widows walked unseen. They were reminders of death, necessary but unwanted. As she walked home through narrow alleys, doors closed quietly around her. Women averted their gazes. Men turned away. No one spoke to her. It wasn't cruelty, it was law. A widow in Sparta was a ghost, a living burden whose purpose was not yet decided. Until she completed the ritual, she existed between worlds, not wife, not widow, not free. Inside her home, Irene placed the bronze disc beside the hearth and unfolded the bloody headband. Her hands shook as she stared at it. It was stiff, darkened by soot, a mark of the last breath of the man she had shared her life with. But even here, she did not cry. That night, she sat awake, listening to the wind move through the courtyard. The same wind that had once carried her husband's laughter. The same wind that now sounded like whispers from the mountain. By dawn, she was ready. The morning of the second day came with a knock. A servant left a folded gray tunic at her door, plain, unadorned, and colorless. The fabric of mourning. Irene knew what it meant. It was time. She bathed in cold water, tied her hair back, and dressed in silence. No jewelry, no scent, no braid. Spartan law forbade beauty during mourning. Grief must not be seen as personal. It must belong to the state. When she stepped outside, 2 guards waited. They led her through the empty streets, past temples and statues, until the city gave way to open ground. Ahead stood the Sanctuary of Shields, a half-ruined temple built from the remnants of old wars. Columns leaned like broken soldiers. Wind howled through the cracks. At the center stood a plinth, and on it Irene's armor. His bronze chest plate was still dented from battle, his helmet resting on top like a crown over emptiness. Irene's knees weakened. The sight of it, his absence made real, struck deeper than any wound. The priestess appeared beside her, face painted white, eyes rimmed with kohl. Without speaking, she motioned Irene to kneel. Her knees met the cold marble. The sound echoed. "You will remain," said the priestess, "until the sun falls. You may not speak. You may not move. You may not cry." From a bowl of ash, the priestess dipped 2 fingers and traced black lines beneath Irene's eyes. "If the lines break, the state will know your weakness." And so it began, the rite of stillness. Hours passed like centuries. The sun rose higher, the heat pressed down and sweat rolled down Irene's spine. But she did not move. Her legs burned, her back ached, but her face remained calm. The wind blew dust into her eyes, but she did not blink. Her thoughts drifted into Irene's laugh, to his voice, to the way he would hum softly when sharpening his spear. She wanted to scream. She wanted to weep until her heart broke. But she didn't. She couldn't. When dusk came, the sky turned red like spilled blood. The bell from the tower rang once, long and low. The priestess stepped forward. Her black eyes searched Irene's face. The kohl beneath her eyes was unbroken. "You have endured," the priestess said. "Sparta accepts your silence." 2 women helped her stand. Her legs trembled, her body felt carved from stone. The priestess turned away and the guards led her back through the fading light. Irene had passed the test. But she understood what that truly meant. It wasn't her faith they measured, it was her obedience. That night she lay awake, her eyes tracing the cracks in the ceiling. Her body throbbed with pain, her knees swollen, her throat dry. But somewhere deep inside, something else had hardened. A small, cold shard of defiance that even Sparta could not touch. And as the wind howled outside, she whispered his name once more. Not for the city, not for the gods, but for herself. The third night came with no rest. The air in Irene's house felt too still, too clean, as if even the walls held their breath. She had passed the rite of stillness, yet sleep refused to come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his armor again, that hollow shell resting on marble, his helmet gleaming where his head should have been. When the knock came before dawn, she already knew. Two shadows stood beyond the door, silent, waiting. One carried a torch. The other motioned for her to follow. No words were exchanged. Words no longer belonged to her. They led her through the cold streets, down an alley that curved behind the sanctuary of shields. The deeper they went, the colder it grew. Soon they reached a narrow stone corridor carved beneath the earth. Moisture dripped from the ceiling. The air smelled of salt and old blood. The torches flickered over walls lined with carvings. Hundreds of women's faces, all with closed eyes and sealed lips. Each one a widow who had once walked this same path. At the corridor's end stood a chamber lit by a single oil lamp. Inside were 5 women dressed in white linen. Their faces were veiled, their hands stained gray with ash. They stood in a circle, unmoving. These were the witnesses, widows who had already endured this ritual and been turned into its keepers. Irene was stripped of her mourning tunic. A pale robe was placed over her shoulders, rough and cold against her skin. It clung like fog, as though even the fabric wanted to erase her. A woman stepped forward and combed Irene's hair with a thin bronze blade, not to groom, but to test her steadiness. If she flinched, if she trembled, she would fail. The blade scraped her scalp. She did not move. The circle began to close in around her. The witnesses studied every part of her face, every twitch of her fingers, the rise and fall of her breath. To them, grief was an infection, something to be cut out before it weakened the state. Then the eldest widow spoke. Her voice was dry, her words as old as the stones. Name your mothers. Name your blood. Irene's voice wavered at first, then steadied. She spoke each ancestor's name in order. Her mother, her grandmother, her great-grandmother, tracing her bloodline back through generations of Spartan women who had endured the same fate. But when she reached for her husband's name, her throat closed. The eldest widow raised her hand sharply. That name is not yours to speak. It belongs to Sparta now. The words cut sharper than any blade. Irene lowered her head and whispered the last name, her own. When she finished, one of the witnesses stepped forward and pressed a thumb dipped in ash to her forehead. Another anointed her lips with oil, not to bless but to seal them. For 7 days, the eldest said, you will not speak to the living. You will not utter sound to servant, child, or neighbor. This silence will purge your weakness and preserve the dignity of the dead. They called it the widow's silence. But every woman in that room knew the truth. It was not to honor the husband. It was to erase the wife. Irene nodded once. No tears, no resistance. The witnesses parted, allowing her to leave. The torchlight followed her up the tunnel. As she reached the surface, the night air hit her like a blade of glass. She wrapped her arms around herself, but the chill came from within. The city was asleep. Only the wind moved through the streets, whispering across rooftops, through cracks and under doors. She walked home alone, each step echoing like a heartbeat in the silence she now carried. Inside her house, the fire had gone out. The bronze disc still lay on the table, and beside it the headband, dry, stiff, stained. She sat in front of them until the first light of morning touched the walls. Her mouth felt sealed shut, not by oil but by fear. In Sparta, silence was obedience, and obedience was survival. 4 days passed in silence. Irene did not speak, not even to the servants who left food by her door. She did not pray, did not hum, did not whisper her children's names. Each hour stretched like a punishment. She began to understand why the elders called it purification. It stripped away not sorrow but memory. When the 5th morning came, she found a scroll on her doorstep, sealed in red wax. She already knew what it meant. The mark belonged to the Ephors, the 5 men who ruled Sparta's laws like gods in mortal form. She broke the seal and read the message written in a single line. You are of age. You are of womb. A new household will be assigned. Her hands went cold. The words were so simple, so clean, that they almost hid their cruelty. In Sparta, a widow under 40 was not a free woman. Her husband's death did not release her. It only reassigned her. Her body, her womb, her future, and all property of the state. That evening, 2 soldiers arrived at her home. They told her to report to the registry hall by dusk. No escort of women, no priestess, no family. Just an order. The hall was long and narrow, lined with carved pillars shaped like spears. Dozens of widows stood in silence, each wrapped in gray cloth, their eyes fixed on the floor. None dared to look at one another. The sound of sandals against marble echoed like the ticking of fate. At the far end of the hall sat an old man, the matchmaker of the state. His task was not romance, it was arithmetic. To him, women were numbers. Each pairing preserved a bloodline, filled a gap, balanced a ledger. When Irene's name was called, she stepped forward. Her heart felt like stone. The matchmaker looked at a scroll, then at her. "You will be joined to Lysandros," he said flatly, "the cousin of your late husband. He is 15 years of age and of warrior lineage. The union ensures continuation of your household service to Sparta." The words struck her harder than any slap. Lysandros, a boy she had seen once as a child, clumsy, shy, his voice barely broken. Now he was to be her husband. She was not asked if she consented. No woman ever was. The matchmaker took a small bowl of iron dust and drew a faint line across her wrist, the mark of reassignment. It would fade in days, but its meaning would not. Then a servant placed a small wooden token in her palm, carved with twin snakes, the symbol of fertility and silence. "Keep it beside your bed," the matchmaker said, "until a son is conceived. Only then will your duty be fulfilled." That was the end. No blessing, no farewell. Her life had been rewritten in a single breath. As she turned to leave, her steps echoed against the marble floor, the sound of chains without weight. Outside, the last light of dusk painted the city in red and gold. Irene looked at the token in her hand. It was smooth, polished, almost beautiful. She wondered how many widows before her had held one just like it. When she reached home, the house felt smaller. The fire was dying, the shadows long. She sat by the hearth, staring into the flames, the token turning between her fingers. It was lighter than she expected. Too light for what it represented. She pressed it between her palms until the edges dug into her skin, but it didn't draw blood. That was Sparta's way. Pain without wound, command without question. That night, she slept beside the headband and the token, one symbol of what she had lost, the other of what she was now forced to become. Outside, the city slept. Inside, Irene began to feel the silence turn from a cage into something colder, a part of her. Before dawn, the sixth day began with the sound of footsteps outside her door. Irene didn't need to look. She already knew what they meant. Her final test had come. A soldier's voice spoke through the wood, calm and cold. "At sunrise you will carry the shield." The words sank into her chest like stones. The shield walk, the last and cruelest ritual of widowhood. Every Spartan woman who lost her husband was forced to perform it. If she failed, her husband's name was erased from the rolls of honor. His children stripped of citizenship, and she herself would be exiled beyond the mountains. There were no second chances. When the first light reached the sky, she dressed in gray and stepped outside. 2 guards waited. They said nothing, only turned and began walking. Irene followed. The air was sharp and cold, cutting through her thin robe. Every window she passed seemed to watch her. The path ended in the Agora, Sparta's great square. Merchants had cleared their stalls, children were kept indoors. Only a silent crowd waited, citizens, soldiers, elders, all standing in perfect stillness. At the center of the square lay a long strip of white marble leading toward a stone monument. Upon its steps rested a shield, bronze, dented wide enough to cover her body. Her husband's Diren's. A priestess stepped forward and unwrapped it from its black cloth. The sun caught the metal, reflecting a red glare across the plaza. Irene's throat tightened. The priestess spoke softly, almost tenderly. "You will carry it from here to the monument. You may not stop. You may not speak. Above all, you may not drop it." Irene nodded once. Her hands trembled as she reached for the shield. It was heavier than she expected, far heavier than she remembered. The weight of a man, the weight of his death. When she lifted it, a ripple of sound moved through the crowd. Not cheers, not whispers, just breath. She began to walk. Each step echoed. Her sandals scraped against marble, the sound hollow and sharp. The shield pressed into her chest, cutting into her palms. Her arms burned. Her shoulders screamed. But she didn't stop. Halfway across the square, the chanting began, not for her, but for Diren. Diren, son of Timarchus. Diren of Phocis. Irene, the fallen. His name filled the air, a sound like iron striking stone. The chant grew louder, rhythmic, relentless, a reminder that she existed only as the extension of his honor. If she fell, he would fall again. The weight grew unbearable. Sweat rolled down her face, her knees shook, her vision blurred. For a moment she felt herself falter. The edge of the shield slipped in her grip. The crowd inhaled sharply. She tightened her hold and pushed forward. Every heartbeat thundered in her ears. The world narrowed to the sound of her breath and the scrape of bronze against her chest. When she reached the monument, she dropped to one knee and set the shield upright before it. The clang of metal rang through the square like a bell. Then silence. Absolute suffocating silence. The priestess approached. Her eyes searched Irene's face. Then she nodded once. She did not fall. The crowd exhaled as one. A few men lowered their heads in approval. The ritual was complete. Irene had proven her strength, or at least what Sparta defined as strength. But as she stepped away from the monument, she felt no triumph. Only emptiness. The shield was gone, but its weight still clung to her body, to her breath, to her bones. By the time she reached her home, the sky had turned gray. The neighbors looked away again. To them, she was not a hero's widow. She was a reminder of what loyalty cost. Inside, the wooden token still sat by the fire. She picked it up, turned it in her hand, and stared at the snakes carved into its surface. Their bodies intertwined, silent, eternal. For the first time in days, Irene allowed herself to think not of Irene but of herself. What had she become? What remained of the woman who once laughed, who once sang while grinding grain, who once dreamed of growing old beside a man who now existed only as bronze and ash? Outside, the last bell of the day rang through Sparta. Irene didn't move. She sat in the dark, the glow of the fire flickering against her empty eyes. The city had tested her, and won. On the seventh day, the silence inside Irene's home was broken by a soft knock. Not the heavy sound of soldiers, not the cold tap of orders. This one was hesitant, almost human. She rose slowly from her seat near the dying fire and opened the door. There he stood, Lysandros, the boy who would be her new husband. He couldn't have been older than 15. His red ceremonial robe hung awkwardly on his narrow shoulders. His skin was pale, his hands trembling as he held a small jug of watered wine. He bowed clumsily, eyes fixed on the ground. "The elders sent me," he said quietly. His voice cracked on the words. Irene didn't answer. She couldn't, the silence of her vow still bound her. Instead, she nodded once and stepped aside, allowing him in. The room seemed smaller with him inside. The air thickened with unease. He set the wine jug on the table and stood there, unsure of what to do. He was not cruel, only frightened, a boy trapped in a ritual too large for him to understand. Irene studied him in the flickering firelight. His face was clean-shaven, his eyes wide, his expression caught somewhere between duty and shame. He looked at her once quickly, then turned away. They sat across from each other without speaking. The fire crackled softly, the only sound between them. Finally, he pushed the cup of wine toward her. She accepted it with both hands, drank, and placed it back. Neither spoke again. That night they shared the same roof but slept apart. She on the floor by the hearth, he on the bed prepared for him by decree. Between them hung the wooden token carved with twin snakes, placed carefully on the table like an invisible chain. Days passed in that strange stillness. Lysandros rarely spoke. When he did, it was only to ask what she needed. Water, wood, food from the market. Irene still said nothing. Her silence had become a second skin. At night she would sit near the doorway and listen to the city breathe. The distant clang of iron, the rhythm of soldiers training, the hum of a world that had moved on without her. One evening she caught him watching her, not with desire but with confusion. He seemed to want to ask something, but fear sealed his mouth. She knew what he wanted to understand, how a woman could live without speaking, how someone could endure the weight of obedience until it became invisible. Once, he tried to speak her husband's name. "Irene," he began, but the word died on his tongue. Irene looked up sharply, eyes filled with something colder than anger. He lowered his head in silence. On the 10th night, the silence between them changed. Not softer, not warmer, simply familiar. They no longer felt like strangers. They felt like prisoners sharing the same cell. The city had stopped watching her now. Women in the market no longer whispered when she passed. They nodded faintly, acknowledging that she had completed every test in stillness, silence, endurance. To them, she was no longer a woman but a role, a symbol that the system worked. And perhaps it did. She had learned to breathe quietly, to walk softly, to think without speaking. The memories of who she once was, the laughter, the warmth, the dreams, had faded into the background like the faint outline of a scar. When she lay down that night, she could still feel the weight of the shield in her arms, though it was long gone. The sound of bronze scraping marble echoed faintly in her mind. Sparta had not killed her. It had done something worse. It had hollowed her out and left her standing. As she drifted to sleep, she turned her head toward the wooden token on the table. The carved snakes seemed to move in the firelight, twisting around each other in endless silence. The weeks that followed were heavy with quiet. Irene and Lysandros moved through the same house like shadows that never touched. He trained each morning with the younger soldiers, returning at dusk with bruises on his arms and the smell of iron on his skin. She cooked, cleaned, and mended his robe, her motions steady, her face unreadable. At night, he would sit across the room, watching the fire burn low. Sometimes their eyes met, not with tenderness, but with the faint recognition of two souls forced to share the same cage. He was learning the discipline of men. She was living the discipline of ghosts. One evening, a messenger brought news from the barracks and another campaign was coming. Lysandros would march soon, though still barely a man. He tried to look proud, but his hands trembled when he tied his belt. Irene watched him from the doorway, a flicker of pity stirring somewhere beneath the armor of her silence. When he caught her gaze, he spoke softly. "I will return," he said. "You need not wait for me to die." It was meant as comfort, but his words pierced deeper than he knew. She turned away. That night, the wind from Tegeta screamed through the shutters, carrying dust and cold into the room. Irene sat by the fire and thought of all the men who had promised to return, and how Sparta turned every promise into stone. The next morning, she rose before dawn and fetched water from the well. The other women were there, gray-robed widows, silent mothers, young brides pretending not to be afraid. They spoke in glances. Every one of them understood what it meant to live for a city that demanded everything and gave nothing back. One of them, an older woman with a scar across her cheek, whispered as Irene passed, "The silence never ends. Even when they're gone again, the silence stays." It was the first human voice directed at Irene in weeks. She didn't answer, but the words sank deep. When she returned home, Lysandros was polishing the same shield that had once belonged to De'Aaron. His arms were too thin to carry it properly, but he tried. She watched him struggle, remembering how that same shield had once cut into her palms during the ritual. For a brief moment, she saw not the boy but every generation of men before him, all bound to the same cycle, all believing their strength built the city, never seeing the women who carried its weight in silence. That night, as he slept, she placed the wooden token with the twin snakes beside his armor. Their carved bodies glimmered faintly in the firelight. For the first time, she wondered what would happen if she didn't obey, if she broke her silence, refused the ritual, or spoke the name the state had stolen. But rebellion in Sparta was not fire. It was frost. It lived quietly, waiting. Days passed. The city prepared for war again. Banners raised, armor shined, prayers whispered to gods who never answered. Irene watched it all from her courtyard, her expression calm, her heart numb. She realized something terrible. Her grief had become discipline. Her silence was now part of the city's rhythm, and yet beneath that quiet surface, something had begun to shift. A thought she could not name, a breath that felt almost like defiance. As night fell, she touched the ashes on the hearth and whispered a single forbidden word, so soft the wind almost stole it. Enough. The next morning, Irene woke before the city bells. Her house felt different, as if something inside it had shifted during the night. The fire was cold, but she didn't light it. She sat in the gray half-light, her fingers tracing the wooden token on the table. The twin snakes twisting endlessly around each other. For the first time, she realized how fragile they looked. She could have snapped it in two with the smallest effort, yet she didn't. Not yet. Outside, Sparta was waking. The clang of shields, the bark of orders, the sound of boys pretending to be men. Lysandros was among them now, his red cloak too bright for his trembling shoulders. He bowed before leaving, saying nothing. She didn't answer, but her eyes followed him until the dust swallowed him whole. When the door closed, the silence returned, but it no longer frightened her. It felt like armor now, something she could use rather than endure. Days blurred into each other. Irene walked through the markets again, feeling the stares of other women. Once she would have looked down, pretending not to notice. Now she looked back. Her eyes met theirs, calm and steady. The widows, the wives, the girls still too young to be promised. They all turned away first. That evening, as she washed her hands in the basin, she caught her reflection in the water. The woman who looked back wasn't the same one who had knelt in the sanctuary of shields. That woman had been afraid. This one was empty, and emptiness, she realized, could be dangerous. The next day, a messenger arrived at her door. A boy no older than 12, carrying another wax seal from the Ephors. She broke it open with trembling fingers. "Your household is incomplete," the scroll read. "The widow's duty remains unfulfilled. A son must be born to restore balance." The words burned her eyes. Another command, another chain. She tore the parchment in half, then again, until it was nothing but ash in her hands. The boy watched her, wide-eyed. "Should I report your answer?" he asked. She stared at him, voice low, calm. "Tell them the wind took it." He nodded quickly and ran, his bare feet slapping against the stones. That night, Irene sat by the hearth, the wooden token beside her. The snakes seemed to coil tighter under the flicker of the flame. She thought of every widow before her, of their silent obedience. The city had fed on their grief for generations, calling it strength. She picked up the token and held it over the fire. The heat licked at her fingers. Her breath quickened, not from fear but from something older, deeper, a pulse that belonged to her and no one else. But then she stopped. Not because she was afraid, but because she wanted them to see her break the law, not hear about it in whispers. She placed the token back on the table and stood. For the first time in weeks, she opened the door and stepped outside after dark. The streets were empty, the air cold. She walked to the edge of the square, to the monument where she had carried Diren's shield. The bronze gleamed faintly under the moonlight. She touched it, her palm leaving a print of ash on the metal. "You died for them," she whispered. "But I live for myself." The words echoed softly, carried by the wind through the silent streets. She turned and walked home, slower this time, her heartbeat calm, her head high. Inside, she blew out the lamp. For the first time, she slept without dreaming of the sea. The next morning, Sparta woke to routine, the clash of iron, the rhythm of drills, the cries of children reciting war songs. But somewhere beneath that rhythm, something had changed. A rumor moved through the women's quarters like wind through dry leaves. Someone had spoken. Someone had broken the silence. By noon, the story reached the market. A widow had gone to the monument and spoken a forbidden prayer, not to the gods but to herself. No one said her name, but everyone knew. Irene. That evening, 2 soldiers arrived at her door. Their faces were unreadable. "You are summoned," one said. She nodded and followed. They took her to the same hall where she had once been judged, the Black Court, its walls as cold as the first time she'd seen them. The 3 elders sat behind the marble table again, their robes dark as mourning cloth. "You spoke," one said flatly. "Yes," Irene replied. "You defied the vow of widow's silence." "Yes." "You desecrated the monument of the dead." "No," she said calmly. "I honored it." The room fell quiet. The eldest leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "Do you understand what this means?" Irene met his gaze. "I do," he expected fear. There was none. The judgment came swift. Her name would be erased from the rolls, her home reassigned. Her children, when they came of age, would not bear her title. In Sparta's eyes, she would never have existed. When they dismissed her, she didn't bow. She turned and walked out into the fading light. The city watched in silence as she passed, women from windows, soldiers from corners, all seeing something they didn't yet understand. That night, she did not go home. She walked beyond the walls to the foothills where the olive trees grew wild. There she sat, her robe torn by thorns, her hair loose for the first time since her wedding. The moon hung low and red above the mountains. She closed her eyes and remembered everything. The weight of the shield, the scrape of marble, the voice of her husband calling her name in dreams. She thought of Lysandros, still a boy trying to be a man. She thought of the widows who would come after her, kneeling before armor that no longer held a body, and she smiled, a small, quiet smile. The kind that comes not from peace but from freedom. When morning came, the guards sent to retrieve her found only footprints in the dirt, leading toward the mountain pass. They searched for days. They never found her. In time, the city forgot her name as it had promised to. But among the women, whispers survived. They said a widow once broke the silence. They said she walked into the mountains and never returned. But her words still echoed when the wind blew from Tegetus. And years later, when the next generation of widows stood before the priestess with coal beneath their eyes, some swore they heard a voice in the wind and faint. Defiant, alive. You died for them, it whispered. But live for yourself. No one ever dared repeat it aloud. But they remembered. And in Sparta, where obedience was worshipped, memory itself became rebellion. Empires are not built only on strength. They are built on silence. The silence of those who endure, who obey, who suffer, so others may call it glory. But every silence has an end, and every obedient voice remembers the moment it was stolen. Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Because history doesn't just belong to kings and warriors. It belongs to the forgotten, to the ones who were told to stay quiet. And as long as their stories are spoken, their silence is finally broken.